So now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Tim Byatt. So Tim is a PhD candidate at the University of Newcastle. He's investigating social capital in adolescents who are deaf or hard of hearing. And he'll explain more about this to you through his presentation. But he's also looking at social capital and its association with other factors such as social communication and well-being of young deaf people. He's been working in deaf education for 14 years and has an additional 5 years experience working as a mainstream high school teacher. So welcome, Tim, and my apologies again to everyone for the lack of captions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Tim, and then you can, and you can share your screen in theory.
Thanks, Anne.
Sorry, there you go.
Okay, thank you. I'll give this a try. Hopefully it will work okay. So, Anne, can you just confirm for me, can you see the PowerPoint slide now?
Yep, I can.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And
I can see you as well, so that's great.
fantastic. All right, great. So thank you for the opportunity and thank you for everyone for coming online on this cold night in Sydney, at least. So I'm going to be talking tonight about social capital, social communication and identity. I won't do the whole introduction because Anne's done a great job of doing most of that, except to just comment that I also have a personal experience of deafness. I have a moderate hearing loss myself. I was diagnosed with a sensorineural moderate hearing loss in the mid-70s, or actually I was born in the mid-70s, but about 1980 when I was 4 years of age. And I've worn hearing aids since that time. So I bring that to my experience as well as a professional experience. And I'm researching at the moment to do with my PhD, social capital, but I also have always had a really strong interest in social communication and identity and how these relate to social capital. So our plan for tonight, I believe we have about 45, 50 minutes. I want to spend around 20 minutes of that talking about social capital, about 10 on social communication, and around 10 minutes on identity. For each of those three areas, I want to talk about what it is, how does it fit, and lastly, its practical application. And really, for all of us here, that is the most important thing. I really want to make this presentation as practical as possible. And insofar as we can, I really want to make it not so much a lecture style, although obviously there's information to be communicated, but I really like to get as much as possible input from the audience as well. So, and with questions, I'm really happy to take questions at really any time. Just throw the question or comment in the chat, and I'm relying on Anne here just to pull me up. And I do have designated time for questions, but I'm really happy to take your questions at any time, and we'll see how we go with that. So, and the other thing which I am going to request of you is to consider my research project. I'm hoping to recruit adolescents with hearing loss and also their parents or carers, but I'll talk more about that as we go. Just regarding the PowerPoint tonight, Anne has agreed kindly to send out a PDF of the PowerPoint, so don't feel as though you need to take notes or remember everything from tonight. You will receive a copy of the PowerPoint in PDF form. I do apologize for my voice. I'm a little bit croaky, so I might pause every now and again for a drink of water. So let's, first of all, what is social capital? So just one moment while I move something aside. So what is social capital? It's really about the connections between individuals and groups. It's often a term that's misused. People talk about social capital in terms of it's just about the size of your network, but it's much more than that. The size of a network does come into it, but it's really about viewing social capital, that second word is key here, as a capital. So how can you actually accumulate it as a resource and then exchange it for benefits? We'll talk about that as we go. In terms of social capital, it's really measuring a number of underlying factors. So we're talking about trust, shared benefits in terms of what can I do for you? What can you do for me? And network size as well. It's also related to the idea of social capital, cultural capital, I should say. So when we talk about cultural capital, what we're talking about is someone's understanding of language, someone's ability to dress in a certain way, communicate with different people. Your cultural capital might also be the types of groups that you associate with. Some practical examples for now. We'll go into more detail later on, but just to get you thinking, some practical examples of social capitals might be, for example, a recommendation for a plumber or another sort of tradesman in your area is a form of sharing trust, sharing recommendations. Membership of sporting clubs and perhaps a local church or other religious organization. So just to give you some brief examples there. So why does it matter? And this is certainly a question I asked myself when I first started learning about social capital 3 or 4 years ago. Really, it's a very practical thing. It provides us with another way of developing opportunities for children with hearing loss. So it's even a way of maybe bypassing those traditional outcomes that we tend to focus on, and which I focus on in my role as a teacher of the deaf as well, working with families around Australia. So when I talk about traditional methods, what I'm talking about there is managing technology, listening, spoken language, sign language, academics, curriculum. They're all really important. But social capital is a way in which you might come around in an alternative manner and provide access to some benefits. Some of these benefits, and I'm going to talk in detail as we go, but might be in terms of friendships, job opportunities, the idea of acceptance in the classroom, in the school, in a wider environment. I will talk specifically to that as we go. It can be something which relates to the individual, so social capital between people, but also between groups and organizations as well. So the idea of you being associated with Aussie Deaf Kids is a great example of social capital and a way of using your association with Aussie Deaf Kids for networking, for advocacy, and to build up your own knowledge. The other thing about social capital, a lot of what we do in working with kids with hearing loss is very much about building up their own skills. And that's really important, as I said. But what I really like about social capital, it's also a way of changing the system, changing the school environment, changing the way that people with hearing loss, and in particular children and adolescents with hearing loss, are understood and are actively included in opportunities in the classroom, in the workplace, and so on. Broadly speaking, there's two ways that we can define social capital. So bonding and bridging social capital. I don't want to spend too long on the theory, but I think it's helpful to have a bit of a working understanding of how you might manage and understand this concept. So first of all, you've got bonding social capital. Social capital that's similar to me in terms of the values, in terms of the social background to me. It relates to my identity. So the people who I spend time with and impact what I think about myself. And it provides strong emotional support. So quite often family, close friends. Bridging social capital is quite different. It's different from me. So it might represent other cultural groups. It might represent even other language groups. It may represent the idea of leveraging different opportunities, giving you access to different opportunities that you don't have in your smaller bonding social capital circle. So these are, for example, friends of friends, memberships, advocacy groups. They're weaker in emotional support. So when things might fall apart, these are not the people we go to. Just spelling mistake, that should be bridging, but they are providing opportunities. And the theory says here, we want a bit of a balance between these two, bonding and bridging. We don't want just one or the other. We want a mix for a healthy identity. In reality, it's kind of sometimes hard to tell what is my bonding and what is my bridging social capital, because they do intersect, and something might start out as more of a work connection, then becomes a friendship. But this is a nice working way to understand them. And as we said, access to different networks and opportunities that I just don't have in my closer circle of friends and family. So tonight I'm going to be talking about social communication as well. I thought it'd be helpful here just to spend a minute or so talking about what is the difference between them. It's a bit confusing because they both use the word social. So as we said earlier, social capital is a resource. I think that's really important to understand, that I find quite difficult to communicate to people, but it's not the social capital itself that is most important, but it's what it leads to. And I'm going to be going through in more detail what that will lead to, but it's sharing support leading to an increase in knowledge, an increase in trust and acceptance, building a sense of competence, which is incredibly important for teenagers. The idea of diversity and understanding different people, and also being understood, even though I may not neatly fit into the mainstream. So again, the factors are, it's measured using trust, reciprocity. So the idea of you help me, I help you, network size, and providing emotional and relational support. But again, I'll say this again, it's not the end goal. Having social capital is nice, having network connections is nice, but really at the end of the day, for it to be beneficial, they must be traded in, they must be exchanged for some opportunity to have some worth. Social communication, again, touching on this very briefly, I'm going to be spending 10 minutes on this later on. Social communication is a term that's often used interchangeably with pragmatics, the idea of language use, and sometimes people will use the term social skills as well. Most often they mean the same thing in terms of the way people use it. In terms of language, social communication is really the building block of any sort of knowledge base that we have, any sort of real development in language. It's the idea of understanding what we mean. It's adapting language. It relates to conversation. And as the name would indicate, it's very social. Predominantly, language is social, and it's about building up connections, and the concept of social communication does relate to that. So in terms of what we can do is break language development down into different parts, and this is what speech therapists and teachers of the deaf do when they're doing programming. You might divide it into listening, semantics, phonology, and so on. Social communication undergirds all of that, and it really is the building block. Starts right from birth and builds up in different ways. It's very functional. Language, social communication is a very functional goal. It's very practical. So I've got here a bit of a mock-up. Emma Jones, I apologize if you know an Emma Jones. This is not them. This is completely fictional. This is someone who what we've done here is we've artificially divided up different resources, I guess, that this person has between the idea of bonding social capital. They have strong immediate family, close friends. In terms of bridging social capital, you can see with this fictional person, there are areas to be developed. They're perhaps, they don't have access to those friends of friends that we talked about earlier, and extracurricular, their opportunities could be developed further there. The idea of cultural capital here, so they've got some strengths here. The idea of a strong linguistic identity through the use of sign language and membership in the deaf community. So again, this is just a way of illustrating how we might be able to somewhat artificially, but divide up this person's strengths and areas to be developed. So what are some practical examples of social capital? And this is where I really want to get your input here for a couple of minutes as well. But some examples that I could think of are certainly the deaf community is a strong example of social capital, sporting clubs, and really any form of extracurricular, whether that be music or a whole gamut of things. My daughter is involved in a drama club and loves that. I think a teacher at deaf, so people in my role, have a strong role of facilitating opportunities, connecting, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. And of course, we can't discount close and extended family and friends. Friends of friends are a great source. In terms of that bonding and bridging dynamic, sometimes the way I like to think of it is that the bonding social capital is perhaps represented by Facebook. These are the people who you share birthday photos with. LinkedIn is more of a formal network. It is people who you maybe don't see very often, but these are people who might be able to help you get a job when you need it, or let you know about a job opportunity. These are people who you might go to for professional development if you need knowledge in a particular area. So I know that's a simplification of what Facebook and LinkedIn are, but it gives you some ideas. And of course, Aussie Deaf Kids and other organisations that really actively advocate on a whole range of deafness issues, connect parents and share knowledge. So, and if you could access a chat, because I can't see the chat at the moment, does anyone have any ideas of other forms of social capital, particularly relating to kids and teenagers with hearing loss? I'd be really interested to hear your perspective.
So Tim, at the moment we don't have anything in the chat.
Yep.
I think for me that I do get lots of phone calls from parents and of trying to connect their teenage children to who feel very isolated because they are in you know, they're the only deaf kid in the school and things like that. So I think this is an area that could be really helpful for families, but it's still quite remote for them, I guess, if they're the only child in the school.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. At the moment, we don't have anything in.
No, that's absolutely fine. And sorry to put people on the spot. I think that's
Sorry,
doubly.
can I just say one more thing, Tim?
Yeah,
Sorry.
go on.
I do think that parents having good social capital can also assist the kids, because that building parental social capital, I think, is also really helpful for kids, so parents with knowledge and connections and things like that is helpful for their kids as well.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think that's particularly why we're focused in our research on teenagers, because when kids are younger, they are very much reliant on their family and parental social capital, and they are actively involved in that. But as the kids get a bit older, and I don't think it's that old actually, I think it's a late primary school age for a lot of kids, they start to develop their own networks, they start to develop their own identity that may be similar, but it's also somewhat different and unique. So the idea of them developing their own social capital and perhaps stepping outside the shadow of that provided by their parents is an interesting area.
We do have a few suggestions coming in now, which is sort of fits really well with that.
Yep.
Is neighbours, school, work, religious groups, swimming class and teachers. So a lot of really interest groups are important as children grow outside others' shadows. So there's a lot of other thoughts coming through there, which is a good example, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll keep going.
Yep.
So in terms of some of the really research benefits, and I hope that you can relate to these in your own life, and I can see in my professional and personal life some of them being realized as well. But really, when you speak to parents, the first thing that they want from their children is for them to be happy. It's pretty straightforward, really. You want your child to be happy, you want them to enjoy going to school, have some friends that they can spend time with, a good connection with their teacher and so on. So one of the biggest benefits of developing social capital, and again, remember the whole term social capital is a little bit artificial. What we're talking, that's an umbrella term for developing trust and understanding and connections between people. So that the idea of being understood, particularly in deaf camps, this comes out in the research literature quite a bit. I think the idea of meeting with other kids who are deaf or hard of hearing is really valuable, particularly, as you said, Anne, for people, for kids who go to a school and perhaps there are only one or two of kids in the school who might have some form of hearing loss. And I think it's particularly valuable for families in rural areas, regional areas where that might be doubly so. Resilience. What's really interesting here is the concept of resilience being developed in kids with hearing loss as they sit alongside their parents who are advocating for them. And this also goes back to what you said, Anne, earlier. A very nice tie-in in terms of as the kids get involved in that advocacy, even if it's only on the sidelines when they're younger, not as direct advocates, the research indicates that that does directly stimulate resilience in them. We'll talk more about that as we go on. I think this one is very important as well, the idea of self-efficacy. And really, that's kind of a fancy way of saying the idea of feeling competent at something, being able to feel as though you can go to school, you can do the work that the teacher is asking you to do, you can spend time at lunchtime with a bunch of friends, and you are going to be included. You are going to be successful on a number of levels. But to put that in perspective, sometimes what we need to be careful of with kids with hearing loss is that they don't develop what you might term learned helplessness, which is in some ways the opposite of the idea of being competent. So that sense that it doesn't matter what I do, I'm not going to succeed. I'm going to be a failure. And that's a really terrible mindset to have. And we need to guard against that. Developing social capital, developing connections can really build up this sense of competency. And learning communities, the idea of it's not just about me completing the work in the classroom, but it's being part of something greater than myself. And two things with learning communities, I'm probably running behind time, so I'll keep going here a bit faster. But the idea about sharing information, it sounds like a very simple thing, but it's incredibly important, particularly with kids with hearing loss. Obviously, we do miss out on things. We don't always hear things. And having a network to be involved in and to work with can help share information. On a practical level, this could be relating to an assessment task at school. It could be relating to fashion and popular culture, which I don't want to trivialize that. That's a really important thing for teenagers, and it helps them maintain connections. And it's the idea of sharing success. It's not about your child against the world, but it's about your child working within a group towards a shared goal. Now, just briefly on language, the idea of social capital, obviously the idea of language in deaf education has been really contentious over the years, and there are multiple perspectives on that. I'm not even going to go into that in great detail tonight, but social capital would really view language as agnostic. What I mean by that, it doesn't say one or the other is better, but whatever works, whatever develops those connections. And on a practical level, and I think we are seeing this on the ground quite a lot, it often means that kids might sign in some circumstances and use spoken language in other circumstances. It's not a black or white kind of dynamic here. So social capital can lead to other opportunities. So just touching on that very briefly, research has shown that even when language level is reduced, and a child may not have completely age-appropriate language levels, developing social capital can develop resources in a different way. For example, it can build up that sense of competence. It can build up that quality of life through those connections that might have been done or might have been built up through language. And a couple of questions to consider here. So how is language associated with social capital? So does the idea of being socially isolated decrease social capital opportunities? It would seem logical that that would be so. And is there a link between social capital and social communication? That's something I'm really interested in researching in more detail. Certainly, as far as I'm aware, we don't know the answer to that, although common sense would tell you it is so. So the idea of family, I mentioned this earlier, parental advocacy, getting involved in IEP meetings, and being really instrumental as you are to provide access. It's a big buzzword at the moment, but what we mean by access, it could mean access to the technology, whether it be a Roger FM or a Cochlear implant. It could be access to a teacher of a deaf. It might be access to sign language interpretation. What we are aware of, and you may or may not have experienced this, I hope not, but parental participation is not always valued by schools. Something we need to be aware of as educators. And families have a key role in identity formation, which I'll talk more about later on. Now, where the rubber really quite often hits the road is with after school. It's fantastic to develop language and listening and sign language. They're really admirable outcomes. But ultimately, the idea of developing social capital is about developing opportunities. And when we say opportunities, we're also talking about economic opportunities. So we want your children and kids and teenagers really with hearing loss to have the same opportunities to succeed with post-school opportunities, with university and so on. So classrooms can lead to increased social capital if you have a teacher who's very inclusive, encouraging and understanding. It's also important to have high but reasonable teacher expectations. Historically, low expectations have been a real killer for deaf and hard of hearing teenagers or students, I should say. So maintaining those high but reasonable expectations is vital. And I think there's a real link here in terms of teacher education. If teachers understand what hearing loss is and what it isn't, then I think they're more likely to have a realistic expectation of what children might achieve in the classroom. And we as teachers have a role in that, but I think it's pretty clear that parents have a role there as well. Just briefly, the idea of navigational capital. Don't have time to go into this into too much detail, but this really refers to role models and really buddying up with someone who understands how the school or workplace, or might even be an informal role in a friendship group. So this person is able to explain the unspoken rules. And that is quite often what's really difficult to understand. Not only do you have to understand the language and the curriculum, but there are a whole bunch of unspoken rules. For example, how do you do group work in a way that is contributing, but also listening? And so the whole interesting area, which I don't have a lot of time to go into now. And developing post-work experiences is really needs to be part of the picture. We can't just stop when we get to year 12 and assume everything's going to be hunky-dory. Briefly, before I move on to social communication. So the idea of inclusion and diversity, what we mean by that is that as kids actively included in the classroom, when I say inclusion, I don't mean participation. Participation is a legal requirement, but we're talking about truly feeling part of the classroom, part of a school, part of a soccer team, whatever it might be. Understanding of hearing loss is really vital. So as people understand it, as I said, and that social capital is developed, people, it's not unusual. It suddenly doesn't become unusual to have a child with hearing loss, and they essentially become a part of the furniture in a positive way. So moving on, and identity formation, exposure to a broad range of people is really important as well. And this is related to the idea of empathy and understanding. So we have a very narrow social capital where people stay in their different groups, the idea of tribes. Then what that can limit is the idea of understanding people who are different from me. But if we're able to not even necessarily accept in an active way, but to understand people who are different from me and empathize with them, then that really has some positive outcomes for kids with hearing loss. Okay, briefly, before I pause for any questions you might have about this, I want to spend just a minute giving a shameless plug about my own research project. So I am investigating social capital, well-being, social communication, and identity, most of the things that I'm talking about tonight. I believe Anne is going to be sending this out. So it is targeted, the research is targeted predominantly at adolescents with hearing loss who are in high school. However, the invitation is initially going to parents and carers, and parents and carers will need to fill out the online consent before teenagers can actually do the survey. The survey would take about 15 minutes. As I said, the parents or carers will start that, and then the adolescent will hopefully complete the survey in about 15 minutes, and it's focused on those areas: social capital, well-being, and social communication. The second part of my research is about more of an in-depth interview. It'll take about 25 minutes per interview. And I'm hoping to interview 12 teenagers with hearing loss and 12 with their parents to really get that in-depth perspective in terms of what is your experience as a teenager with hearing loss, with networks, with the idea of identity, and how do these all interrelate with social communication. So if you are a parent of a teenager with hearing loss in high school this year, would really appreciate you considering this research invitation. If you're not, but you know someone, please do forward the email that Anne will send after today. It's a very small population in terms of adolescents with hearing loss in Australia. Because we are going through parents, it is quite hard to recruit. So I really do appreciate you considering that invitation. And my name and number there, please do call or email. I'm happy to discuss further. Questions? I've done a lot of talking. Any questions about what I might have said so far?
So Tim, there's no questions. I was just wondering if the research says anything about children having deaf mentors, so adults the same, with similar hearing loss or similar experiences, and whether the advantages of that for social capital in terms of just your general community and things like that.
Yeah, definitely, Anne. So directly and indirectly. So the idea of role models is quite a strong area in the literature, and having deaf role models is really important, particularly perhaps older role models who have that experience of the particular community. And that's a term, navigational capital, the idea of someone who's able to take you under their wing and tell you some of those informal rules, what you might call the rules of the game. So we're all in a game, whether it's at work or even in the family dynamics. I think what's sometimes difficult for, well, I say people, but I mean particularly children and adolescents with hearing loss, is that understanding some of those nuances isn't always apparent. So having someone who's able to guide them. And the other area that relates to the question there would be the idea of deaf camps or deaf and hard of hearing camps, and the idea of being mentored in that environment, but also not even just mentored, but having someone to relate to with a similar experience, which can be problematic.
Yeah, so we're not, is building independence in daily activities, transport timelines, communication from an early age advantageous?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what my starting point in terms of whenever I get a new client or child I'm working with, it's got to be the #1 goal. So I would phrase that in terms of working from dependence to interdependence. So I used to use the word independence, but I don't think any of us are truly independent, but making us as independent as possible. And also, yeah, absolutely, I would totally agree with the questioner in terms of developing the idea of being able to do things for yourself as much as possible. And that's going to look different at different ages. So for example, with a 5-year-old, it might be helping change the batteries of the hearing aid. Maybe with an older teenager who's 15 or 16, it might be giving a presentation to the class about your hearing loss, or it might be participating themselves in the IEP meeting. Certainly, I think that's really important. I wouldn't want to push the point too hard though, because I do think it's important that the idea of social capital isn't about doing it alone. It's really about being able to tap into different groups and taking the onus off the individual a little bit in terms of cooperation.
So Tim, I've got one more question for you that's not here. Is it ever too late to build social capital?
No, I don't think so. And I'll use myself as an example here. Ironically, I am not particularly good at developing social capital myself, seeing as I'm researching the area was somewhat ironic. But I think it's harder for some people than others. I'm a bit of an introvert, So I'm not a natural networker. And I think for some people who are more extroverted, they're going to develop their networks, particularly their bridging or more less close networks, easier. But I do think it's never too late, absolutely. And it's going to look different at different stages.
Thanks, Tim. There's no more questions at the moment.
No worries, we'll keep going. So I am running a little behind time. So social communication. I would think that most people would have some experience with social communication. It may have been called pragmatics. It's a part of language. It's the rules that we follow. And those rules can relate to how we have a conversation, how we take turns, how we end a conversation. It's the way that we change language. For example, how do you change topics politely? Knowing the appropriate context. So the way that we speak in a formal presentation compared to how we speak with our work colleagues at lunchtime, or how we speak to people we've known for 20 years and we meet for a drink in a cafe. I mean, we use different ways of communicating. There are 3 areas here that I've identified relating to social communication, which I think the research indicates that these are all areas that sometimes kids and perhaps even adults as well with hearing loss find difficult. So having the right amount of space between speakers, and again, a lot of these are very cultural. What might be appropriate in Australia might be quite different in a different country. How loudly we talk, how we use our body language. For example, how much eye contact do we have? Our tone of voice. Now, with going back to this briefly, you can see how some of these are going to be particularly problematic, so particularly difficult for a person who struggles to hear everything that's happening. Now, the idea, if you're having difficulty hearing someone, you are naturally going to move a bit closer. You are naturally going to want to talk a bit louder or want the other person to talk a bit more loudly. So some of these, you can see why they might be problematic. The idea of topic maintenance is quite a difficult one. Staying on topic. A lot of the work that I do with the kids that I work with, and I do work with a number of teenagers and school age kids, is narrative storytelling procedural kind of work, where I'll ask the teenager or child to retell a story in 3 sequences. What happened on the weekend? And this can be really quite difficult. It sounds like quite a simple skill, but the idea of planning and staying on topic is really important. How do we change topics? How do we do that politely, that in a way that doesn't leave the other person behind? And on the same token, are we responding to topic changes? How do we end conversations politely in a way that builds up friendships and maintains friendships? This is a really big one in terms of for people with hearing loss. Sometimes we can fluctuate between 2 ends of the scale, having a balance between talking and listening. And I think, broadly speaking, there's kind of 2 ends to that. Someone can be quite dominating, and if someone is dominating in the conversation, there are many reasons why they might do that. But from a perspective of hearing loss, sometimes they may do that because it's a way of controlling the conversation and minimizing the times where I can make a mistake. If I'm doing most of the talking, as I am doing tonight, if I'm doing most of the talking, there's not much opportunity for me to mishear what's going on. The other end of the scale might be someone who's very passive and doesn't have a lot of confidence to really actively contribute to the conversation. So we want a balance between those two positions. Another pretty major area, which I work a lot on, is the idea of communication breakdown and repair. So unfortunately, I think it's a fact of life that for someone with a hearing loss like myself, there are going to be times when communication does break down, when I don't understand what someone said. For children, the first thing we need to work on is, am I aware when I haven't been understood? Am I aware when I've not understood someone else? Again, sounds very straightforward, but building up that self-awareness has got to be a starting point. Once we've built up that self-awareness, we have to build up the ability to ask for clarification. So we need to build up strategies here. And obviously what you do with a 5-year-old is going to be different to what you do with a 15-year-old. But asking for clarification, knowing when you can let something slip, and you can find out the information through maybe written sources, maybe speaking to the person after the event. And certainly I think we need to acknowledge that communication breakdown, misunderstanding can be really embarrassing at a time when we want to be accepted. It's a way in which we're drawing attention to ourselves. And I don't know if there's any real way of avoiding that, but there are some things that we can do. And part of that is building up a healthy identity, building up an understanding of the way my deafness affects me. And I will talk about that as we go. Being able to explain what I mean, maybe in different ways, rather than just repeating what I've said. And a really practical way of this effect is in the classroom. Do I understand what the teacher has asked me to do? So some practical application for this area. So this is really difficult to actively plan for when I have video conference sessions with families. Very hard to plan for communication breakdown. And it requires a fair amount of trust, which is quite often, I think, why as parents, you're in a really unique position to teach this. But certainly it's something that you would address as it comes up. Whereas listening work and language work and teaching signs can be very much planned for. Again, misunderstandings, if we are missing things and communication is breaking down, then this can lead to conflict. And I do spend a fair amount of time talking about conflict, particularly with teenagers and kids who are older primary school, because understanding conflict and understanding perspective is really important. Misunderstanding does increase the potential of conflict. What's incredibly important, and again, we'll talk about this in more detail with identity, is understanding my hearing loss. So understanding it from a physical perspective, so maybe understanding my audiogram, but also understanding what it means socially to me. How does it make me unique? Self-advocacy, I think someone addressed this earlier. So the idea of moving from what you might say being totally dependent on the parents and the teacher to self-advocating. Any questions at this point?
We don't have any questions, but I do have a question.
Yep.
So a lot of this are things that parents can do. So when you talked about building up self-awareness, is that something that the parents could request of the teacher of the deaf, or what are there resources that parents can use to facilitate that in their own child?
Yeah, I think so, Anne. I think I would be, in terms of sometimes with teachers, we need to speak a bit of teacherese. And I would certainly be saying, how would you rate my child's social communication ability? Maybe not use the word rate, but how would you describe my child's social communication ability? Are they always understanding what's going on in the classroom? In terms of, they take a spoken language approach, you might say, are they being understood by their peers? These are the kind of questions. But certainly in terms of as parents, I think it's always a hard one, because kids are kids, and we don't want to be spending all of our time correcting their speech and teaching them how to self-advocate, because we need to allow them to be kids as well. But I think it's a matter of picking the moment and not spending all our time on it, but gradually, because you're in a unique position where you have trust built up with the kids, and again, that bonding social capital, where you perhaps do have an in that the teacher wouldn't have, to really gently teach about, well, I think you've misunderstood that, I'm sorry, or something along the lines. But again, this is a real issue for your child. You don't want to be doing this 20 times a day. It's getting that balance right, I suppose.
So there is one question, Tim.
Yep.
Is there some sort of assessment for these concepts to see where the child has gaps and know where to focus attention for improving skills?
Yeah, there are some assessments. I think when you have a language assessment completed, it's much easier to assess other language areas in a more scientific way, I suppose. So semantics and language level and so on. There are a few checkbox kind of assessments. As part of my research, I've developed one which at the moment is not publicly available. At the moment, is unvalidated. But I think there are assessments. In particular, there's one by Yoshinaga Atano and her research group, which she included. I can email it to you another time, Anne, if I'm happy for you to distribute it. Yeah.
We might be able to put a few resources together.
Sure. Yep.
Send out the email. I think that might
But
be
I mean,
helpful.
it is a harder area to really assess formally.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Tim. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry, I'm running a little behind time. So finishing off tonight with 5 or so minutes on identity. So the idea of identity theory, particularly as it relates to deafness, has traditionally been framed in terms of hearing, deaf, bicultural, that is having a hearing and a deaf identity, and marginal identity. Language plays a big part in this. Obviously, the deaf community typically use sign language, and when I say deaf community, I'm talking about capital D deaf. How does this idea fit into the idea of our broader self? And are these theories still relevant? In my opinion, they're a good starting point, but I think sometimes they can overemphasize the idea of our deaf identity. Is my deafness the most important thing about me? Personally, I would say no. Others may say yes, it's a personal choice in terms of how we define ourselves, but it's not all who we are. We're defined by many other things. So our other identities might complement, that is, sit alongside our deaf identity, or it might conflict with it, particularly in terms of conflicting. Example, if you are particularly in a culture that doesn't associate with perhaps the deaf community, and you are involved with that, then the literature would say that can form some conflict. But again, I don't think it has to, certainly. And what is clear, and I think what I alluded to earlier, is that children and adolescents do engage with their deafness earlier. So some would say, and the theory would say, that the most important idea or job of the adolescent is to work out their identity. That engagement with the idea of who I am and what makes me who I am is brought about sooner for children with hearing loss. And I think the reason for that would be because they are encountering certain hurdles. It might be managing technology, it might be having to have extra assistance with language development, whatever it might be, but that is bringing about that engagement with their identity earlier. And challenges faced really support and bring up these that trigger the identity. Unfortunately, terms like normal and fitting in and really very politically incorrect terms are used by the kids in the literature. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. Like as adults, we would never say, I want to be normal, because that doesn't really sound very nice. It's not very pleasant. And it's almost implying that you're not normal. But in the literature, this is a language that the kids are using. When I say kids, I mean teenagers. So the idea of that really relates to acceptance. It's not about wishing that they could hear necessarily, but it's more an indication, and this is not all kids with hearing loss, but a certain percentage of kids with hearing loss don't feel as though they're able to fit in and be normal. And that's problematic. Speaking personally in my journey, and again, this is anecdotal and I'm a sample of one, I think what's equally important is the idea of not just other people accepting me, but also the idea of self-acceptance. And I think that comes with confidence as well. So some of you may be familiar with asphyxia, recent author of a great novel, young adult novel called Future Girl. And what I love about this quote, and I'm just taking a screenshot here from Facebook, if you define me, I'm deaf, but being deaf is not the most remarkable thing about me. And I can really relate to that. And I think as teachers and parents, we need to be really careful that we teach our kids to be proud of who they are as people with who are deaf or hard of hearing, however they might define that, but also to be aware that there are other factors. Maybe they define themselves culturally, maybe they define themselves in terms of other kids and what they associate with. There are many ways that we can define ourselves besides our hearing loss. But I think what is important, no matter which way you look at it, is an understanding of our deafness. Now, I used to think that only those people who were capital D deaf could use that term deafness, but I've changed my opinion in recent years, because I think sometimes we can use the idea of deafness without necessarily using sign language. Now, I personally don't fluently sign, and I don't have any beef with those who do. In fact, I'd like to learn more sign language myself. But at this point in my life, I'm not a fluent signer. However, I am deaf on some level. My experience with hearing loss has influenced the person I am today, for better or worse, and an engagement with what that means, in my opinion, and the research backs this up, is really important. What's also reinforced is an understanding of self, but also an understanding within families. And I think this is a fantastic example of bonding social capital. So understanding deafness, it may relate to learning sign language. It may also relate to an understanding that there are certain times when my child doesn't hear, and that's okay. Or perhaps an understanding that I might need to use some physical touch with my child to get his or her attention. It may relate to the idea of understanding that they have a certain amount of listening fatigue, and at the end of the day, perhaps I just need a bit of downtime. So speaking of that understanding, it might relate audiologically, or it might be to that capital D, deaf identity. And again, it may differ on where you are. And that's pretty clear in the literature as well, in terms of perhaps your child might sign with their friends and take a more spoken language approach in the classroom or at home. It can take up many forms. So finishing with this, one thing we do need to be careful of and very aware of is marginal identity. So this, when we say marginal identity, this is people who don't identify as either deaf or as hearing. So having some form of identity is really important. And in the literature, this relates to those who take up more of a hearing identity, but really maybe don't have the finely developed listening skills to really be able to participate. So what we don't want to happen is for children to have neither a hearing nor a deaf identity. A mix of the two is ideal. We need to avoid labels. So we need to allow identity to develop over time. And that will most likely continue throughout the child's life as they become an adult. And be aware that identity will quite often be a mix of the two, as I've said. So that's all I've got for tonight. I do apologize for running a bit over time. Again, I'd really appreciate your consideration with the research project. I think Anne is going to email that. And I'll just leave some space at the end if anyone has any question or comment to make.